everyone. Welcome back to the Manic Manor podcast. This is Mitchie. And for today's episode, we are going to look at one of the most infamous Satanic Panic cases that has been known to American history. That is of the West Memphis 3. Now, anybody who doesn't know the case, there were 3 teenagers at the time in 1994 who were convicted of a triple homicide of 8-year-old boys. Those boys were Christopher Byers, Stephen Branch, and Michael Moore in West Memphis, Arkansas. And like I said, this entire trial was riddled with accusations that the 3 teenagers in question were part of satanic cult rituals, and that their motives were influenced by things like books, movies, the way that they dressed, having nail polish on their fingers, the music that they listened to. It was pretty much cut and dry that they were being labeled as, different. And this was during a time in America, the 1980s, 1990s era, where people, if you were outside of what was considered normal, especially in the Deep South, you were often viewed as satanic. So we're going to talk about that story, and we're also going to talk about the lack of justice for all that was involved. I'm also going to start out by saying that there is a documentary on HBO Max called Paradise Lost. It's a 3-part series, and each episode is 2 to 3 hours long. It's a really good documentary, but I'm also going to tell you that there is a trigger warning because they do show the bodies of the boys during the first and second episodes hot and heavy. So you need to take that into mind before you decide that you're going to watch it. But going into the story. So on May 5th, 1993, there were 3 little boys who were reported missing from their homes in West Memphis, Arkansas. The first report was made by the adoptive father of Christopher Byers. This was John Mark Byers. He reported them missing at 7 o'clock in the evening. It was claimed that the boys were last seen playing together about half an hour prior, so at 6:30, with the stepfather of Stevie Branch, who was Terry Hobbs, calling at the boys that they needed to come home. After that, they disappeared. They weren't ever seen again. A search of the area by friends and family showed nothing. Now, individually speaking of the boys, they were all students at Weaver Elementary School in the 2nd grade, and they were all Cub Scouts and very good friends with one another. Stevie was the son of Stephen and Pamela Branch, and his parents divorced when he was just a little baby. His mother would later go on to remarry Terry Hobbs. Now, when he disappeared, Stevie had blonde hair, blue eyes, was last seen wearing blue jeans and a white t-shirt. He also had lived with his mother, stepfather, and half-sister at this time. Chris, at the time of his disappearance, was Christopher Mark Byers, but he was born to Melissa DeFeer and Rick Murray. When he was 4, they divorced, and then his mother would go on to marry John Mark Byers. John adopted him, and he took on John's name. Now, Chris had light brown hair and was last seen wearing blue jeans, dark shoes, and a white long-sleeve shirt. He, at the time, lived with his mother, adoptive father, and a stepbrother. Michael Moore was born James Michael Moore, but went by Michael, and he was born to Todd and Dana Moore. He had brown hair and was last seen wearing blue pants, and it was noted that he very much loved being a Boy Scout so much that he would just be seen pretty much consistently living in his uniform. He, at the time, lived with his parents and his younger sister. It would be the following day, on May 6, 1993, that the 3 boys were found in a ditch in the woods of Robin Hood Hills, after they had been reported missing by their parents less than 24 hours prior. They were discovered to be brutally beaten, hogtied, and naked. And unfortunately, this is a trigger warning. I want you to skip forward a couple of seconds if you can't take to listen to this, because Chris Byers was found to be castrated. And it was such a horrific scene. But the scene, despite being horrific, yielded little evidence. It was suggesting that they had merely been dumped off. The area seemed to be either swept clean, or it was just an area where they had been dumped because there was a lack of blood and fibers. Immediately, this case gathered quite a bit of attention, and the rumors started to circulate quite quickly. The boys had been found in the woods, the way that their bodies were positioned, especially with the castration of Chris, it all concerned the people that were living in the nearby area that maybe Satanism had played a factor in this murder. This was the early 90s, and anything that deviated from the path of being quote-unquote normal was considered satanic. This was the Deep South. And even in today's world, there are still people, especially in the South, that would have this mindset. Granted, they grew up from that time, but they still, people, even if they grew up in that time, they're still people that, to this day, because I live in the Deep South, they still have that mindset. Now, the inspector on the case was Gary Gitchell, and he was informing the public within a matter of days that there were a number of explanations and theories for the murders of the young boys, one of which was that the murders, of course, was considered committed by somebody that they considered the boys to know. Investigators went through clues on what could have happened. They looked at potential suspects, such as people who were known to torture animals, and even military individuals, because they thought that the boys were tied up like, prisoners of war. So anybody was being looked at that was considered, deviating from the normal path. Now, at one point, the authorities did track down a man, and the man was known as Morgan Down, who had ran an ice cream truck, and he had met Stevie at least once before Stevie's death. He had up and moved randomly to California just a few days after the boys had been found. When he was brought in and questioned, he seemed to be very skittish, and of course, if you're being questioned by the police, that's not uncommon that you're going to be a little nervous, even if you are innocent of whatever crime that you think that they're trying to accuse you of. But at one point during this questioning, he stated that he was being admitted into AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, and that his family had called him a drug addict, and that he potentially could have been blacked out because of the alcohol and drugs and killed 3 boys. But very quickly he recanted that confession, and they didn't seem to follow back up on the lead. So this Morgan guy, he was able to go off scot-free, and that was the last that we ever heard of him. Now, the county that the boys were found in was Crittenden County. There was this juvenile probation officer named Jerry Driver, and like quite a few officers and civilians that were in the area at the time, he too had believed that there were satanic cults practicing within the area. One of the boys, or the teenagers that he picked out, was Damien Eccles. Damien was in Driver's care until he turned 18 years old after being arrested for burglary and quote-unquote sexual misconduct. It seemed that Driver had this negative bias against Damien because the longer he spent time around him, the more he seemed to be convinced that Damien was part of a cult. Now, Damien had denied ever being a cult member or even practicing Satanism, but he did admit to believing in and practicing magic, and this was something Driver brought up to the West Memphis police. Now, another one that was brought up was one of Damien's friends, Jason Baldwin. They were both considered to be outcasts. Damien wore, black. He had the black trench coat, had his hair styled like he was, alternative, wore nail polish, had the black umbrella that he would have out when he was walking. But Jason wasn't really like that. They did spend a lot of time together, and because he was linked with Damien, he became a suspect as well, despite not having any kind of link to Satanism. It was simply because he was just friends with Damien. The third person that was brought up was a individual named Jesse Miskelly Jr. Now, he was known to only have an IQ of about 72. He didn't really have a whole lot of connection to Baldwin nor Eccles, but he babysat for a woman named Vicki Hutchinson, and she was a woman who volunteered to help the police investigate the case of the 3 murdered boys. Now, she went to Miss Kelly and asked a lot of questions about the case and somehow got him to agree to introduce her to Damien Eccles, who was already, the top suspect in the case. I should also preface this by saying that the 3 teenagers really didn't have any connection with these boys, but somehow it got pinned on them. Now, Hutchinson went to the police to say she had persuaded Eccles to take her with him to a witch gathering, and Miss Kelly Jr. had tagged along to this. Now, all three of the teenage boys were quite literally upfront suspects. Now, at the time, Miss Kelly was about 17, Baldwin was 16, Eccles had turned 18. Now, Miss Kelly was brought in for questioning and led to a room, and he was held for several hours. After all of this, we only have about 30 to 40 minutes of recorded conversation between Miss Kelly and the police. Towards the end of the interrogation, Miss Kelly ended up confessing and implicating himself. He also implicated Baldwin and Eccles of the crimes. Now, it should be noted that this confession that Miss Kelly tended to contradict himself multiple times, but it didn't matter to the police. They took it, and then they arrested all three of the boys by June 3rd, 1993. Now, immediately, Miss Kelly began to recant his confession, citing that he was confused and coerced and was attempting simply to cooperate with the police without realizing any of the implications. This didn't help at all, though. The boys were forced to remain in custody. Now, while preparing for the trial, they ended up finding blood on a knife previously owned by John Mark Byers, who was Christopher's stepfather. The knife had been given away shortly after the boys' murders, and the blood found on the knife was determined to be consistent with either Chris's blood or Mark Byers' blood as well. However, the police decided that they were not going to pursue that lead, and in the documentary, John Mark Byers talks about it and heavily denies any kind of involvement with his adoptive son's murder. There was also another lead that never got pursued. It was called in by a local Bojangles restaurant in the area. An employee had noticed a man who came in very disoriented, covered in blood and mud, the night that the boys went missing. He had gone into the place and left smears of blood all over the bathroom walls. Apparently samples were took, but the evidence ended up being lost. So going on to the trial, Miss Kelly's confession, despite being recanted, they still used it and severed him from Eccles and Baldwin's trial. The prosecution at the time was John Fogelman and was hoping for Miss Kelly to testify against Baldwin and Eccles. However, Miss Kelly refused to do that. Now, the trial began January 26, 1994 for Miss Kelly. Baldwin's and Eccles began a month later, around February 28th, and it became a damn frenzy. The judge at the time was David Burnett. The prosecution and the defense teams determined and fought over what could and couldn't be submitted to the jury for evidence. Now, the jury was allowed to hear all sorts of various things, including very strange things, such as testimony from a supposed cult expert who indicated that the music collections of the boys and the clothes that they wore were key indicators of satanic cult activity. A lot of other evidence was presented to the jury that was rather more circumstantial than it was anything. It was simply a lack of evidence at the crime scene. That being said, the defense failed to present substantial evidence regarding the police investigation's nature against the boys or the retraction of the key testimony that could have helped them. There was also the judge's refusal to allow certain things to be heard during this trial, and as a result, at both trials, the defendants were found guilty of these crimes. Miss Kelly and Baldwin were sentenced to life in prison with an additional 40 years added onto Miss Kelly's sentence, and Eccles, because he was 18 years old at the time, was sentenced to death. Numerous appeals were filed by the West Memphis 3, as they have come to be known in the media. The case fell apart as time progressed. Hutchinson, who had initially helped out the police, came forth and claimed that the police told her what they wanted her to say. It also came to light that the jury foreman admitted to discussing the case with his own attorney, which is something that is highly forbidden in law, especially in the United States. Then it came to the forefront that there was DNA at the crime scene that had matched Terry Hobbs, who was the stepfather of Stevie Branch. Now, the case gathered quite a bit of notoriety with the documentaries and celebrities that came up showing their support for the West Memphis Three, because a lot of people, including these celebrities and even civilians alike, started to believe that maybe these guys had been falsely convicted. Now, in 2010, the Arkansas Supreme Court ordered a hearing take place to analyze new evidence to potentially exonerate the boys who had now spent quite a bit of time in prison. Eccles, with his new defense team, found that the new evidence didn't necessarily rule out to a new perpetrator, but it was still circumstantial at the best. However, Eccles' team still was convinced that the West Memphis Three was innocent and worked hard and aimed for a new approach. They met with the Attorney General at that time, who was Dustin McDaniel, and they asked if the team would reconsider or even consider just skipping a hearing in order to move straight to the trials. While they negotiated on what to do, Eccles' side suggested to enter in an Alford plea at the time. This required the three defendants plead guilty to a series of lesser charges, while at the same time stating on the record that they were innocent and only pleading guilty simply because it was in the best interest. Now, both sides did eventually end up agreeing to do that type of plea. Now, on the 19th of August 2011, Judge Lacer approved of the Alford plea, and the case came to a strange type of close, with the West Memphis Three finally being released on time served. It's nearly 30 years since this crime had happened, and sadly, we just don't have an answer as to who actually was the murderer of these young boys. The young boys did not get their justice, and the West Memphis Three, who were originally convicted in 1994 of the crimes, continue to pursue this case and keep it alive in their own way and seek justice for not only themselves to clear their names, but they're also in a way seeking justice for the boys. As of April 11th of this year, the Arkansas Supreme Court did finally rule for new DNA testing of evidence from the crime scene to proceed. They overturned a previous ruling in 2022 that had struck down DNA testing. Now, Damian Eccles released a statement recently thanking the Arkansas Supreme Court for finally agreeing to open up the DNA testing door that might finally reveal the truth about this case. So Damian and his attorney seem to hope that with technology being more advanced now than what it was in the 1990s, that we will finally get a break in the case. Now, it's been long enough that Stevie, Michael, and Chris deserve justice and to finally rest in peace. It's also time for Damien, Jesse, and Jason to finally get a chance to live their lives as regular human beings. And I say this because they had finally had evidence enough to prove that there was nothing linking those three teenage boys who are now grown men to that crime scene. So unfortunately, they had spent a lot of time in prison serving for a crime that they simply did not commit. But I do commemorate them for not holding grudges against people, even though they had every right to do so. But as of now, that is all that we really know on the West Memphis Three. This case continues to be brought to light, and they're still seeking answers to this day. If there's anything about this case that I missed out because, I'm just trying to summarize it the best for everybody, please feel free to let me know. You can reach out to me at manicmanorpodcast@gmail.com. You can also reach out on Facebook and Instagram at Manic Manor Podcast. And if you feel so inclined, you can also donate on Patreon, patreon.com/Manic Manor Podcast. So until the next episode, I hope you guys have a fantastic weekend, and I hope you guys keep it safe. Bye-bye.